Why did you move out to Singapore? What was the motivation here?
Well, Asia is the wave of the future. Moving to London in 1807 was brilliant. Moving to New York in 1907 was brilliant. If I'm right, moving to Asia in 2007 will be a brilliant. You can ask me in 80 years and we'll know if I was right or not. But I've got, this is the wave of the future. I have two little girls born in 2003 and 2008. I want them to grow up in Asia, and I want them speaking Mandarin. The 5-year-old speaks perfect Mandarin now, but I want both of them to grow up continuing to speak Mandarin because it's going to be the most important language in their lifetime.
That's because that's where the capital and the production is.
Well, throughout history, the center has moved to where the money is, and as you know, the largest creditor nation, the largest debtor nations in the world are in the West, and the largest creditor nations in the world, China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong. All the money is here now, and that historically has meant this is where the action moves.
So where does that leave the Western nations, Britain and America specifically?
Well, I don't particularly like saying it, but America is the largest debtor nation in the history of the world. There's never, ever been a nation this deep in debt to the rest of the world. The UK is also a huge debtor nation, and countries that have gotten themselves into this kind of situation historically have never gotten out of it unless there was a crisis or a semi-crisis, and I don't see any resolution. The people in London and people in Washington don't seem to understand the problem, and the solutions they're coming up with are not going to work.
There is an argument from Washington and London that as long as you can, the answer is you prevent some sort of calamity by borrowing more now, because it means you'll have to borrow proportionally less in the future if you hit it now. That's the lesson of Japan, they say.
No, that's not well, that's what they say the lesson of Japan is, but that's not correct. The idea that you can solve a problem of too much debt and too much consumption and too much borrowing by more borrowing and more consumption and more debt, to my mind, is ludicrous, insane. Now, the Japanese spent huge amounts of money in the 1990s, and they had the lost decade. They spent tremendous amounts of money. What the Japanese didn't do was what they did do also was to prop up zombie banks, as they called them, zombie companies. They refused to let anybody fail, and therefore they had the lost decade of the 1990s. They were spending a lot of money. No, you cannot believe how many bridges were built to nowhere, how many highways were built to nowhere. But the problem was they wouldn't let the system clean out, let people go bankrupt and start over. So they still haven't recovered.
But there's a consensus in the West that fiscal stimulus is the way to get us out of this hole.
There's a consensus among people in Whitehall and people in Washington, D.C. that that's the way to do it. There are people who do not agree with that approach at all. There are people who would say that saving and investing is the way to get out of this. Take your pain and get over with. South Korea went through this. They had a horrible 2 or 3 year period, and then they came out okay. Russia, Mexico, many countries have been, Sweden, many countries have been faced with this kind of problem before. They make people who failed go bankrupt, and then the people who are competent take over the assets from the incompetent and start over. But what you have now, you have the governments taking the assets away from the competent, giving them to the incompetent, and saying to the incompetent, okay, now you can continue to compete with the competent people's money. I mean, this is horrible economics. It weakens the whole system. Look at the UK. We look at America. Many people kept their powder dry, saw problems were coming, and didn't make a lot of mistakes. Now, the way it normally works is those people now take market share away and boom, and grow, and the system regenerates and starts over. That's not what we're doing now. Those people even weaken themselves, and they cannot expand and grow.
We have a situation now that in a few weeks' time, Gordon Brown is going to try and lead the world at the G20 summit in London, a summit he's comparing to the London summit of 1933. Lead the world out of this recession, prevent depression through these sorts of methods. What do you say to that?
Well, I would remind you what happened at the London session of 1933. It failed, it fell apart, and nothing came out of that. And the depression continued until the Second World War. And there are people who would say that the Second World War partly was a result of the Great Depression of the 1930s. I'm afraid they're making many of the same mistakes. You know, America's already talking about taxing capital or raising taxes, just as America did in 1930. Many countries are talking about protectionism, increased protectionism. All the politicians decry protectionism, and yet they turn around and then do it. America just passed a Buy American bill, Hire American. I mean, all the countries are doing it at the same time that they say no protectionism. Unfortunately, everybody's making the same mistakes we made in the 30s. They're making the mistakes that the Japanese made in the 1990s, and this is going to be worse. The 30s started out as a typical stock market bubble popping, then a recession. But then the politicians got together and made mistake after mistake after mistake, and it led to the Great Depression. I'm afraid it's happening again.
So what? The politicians' mistakes being made right now, including by Gordon Brown, could lead to a world depression?
Yes, yes, and not just Gordon Brown. Let's not pick on Gordon Brown. I mean, he's one of many that seem to be making the same mistakes. Gordon Brown once said, as you may know, that a sign of a weak currency is a sign of a weak economy, which is a sign of a weak government. I quote Mr. Brown.
When you made some comments earlier this year about sterling, it being finished, it was quite a reaction from the government about that. Do you stand by those comments, and what was your reaction to the reaction?
Well, I was a little surprised at the reaction. It was just an offhand comment. I happened to be interviewed at a time when the day that they poured gigantic amounts of money down a rat hole again, and I happened to say in an offhand way, well, yeah, sterling's finished. The UK has nothing to sell to make up for the drying up of the Black Sea, of the North Sea, and the drying up of the City of London. And then we went on to something else for another 10 minutes. The only thing the British press picked up on, of course, was sterling is finished. Well, I don't like saying it, but Britain is one of my favorite countries. I went to university there, I got married there, I've done a lot of things in the UK. Unfortunately, the North Sea is drying up. There's going to be a huge hole in your balance of trade. It's going to get worse, not better. And the City of London is drying up. And that's another huge hole in your balance of trade. I don't see anything that the UK has that they could sell enough of to fill up those two holes. So therefore, in my view, the currency is going to be under pressure over the next several years. I have no position in sterling right now. I'm neither long nor short. I'm just saying this is what's happening in the world. And unless you can tell me something that the UK has to sell, which is going to fill up two big, big holes, then sterling has finished. Again, I don't like saying it. And remember, the UK has already got a big balance of trade deficit and already got gigantic deficits, and now it's just getting worse.
People were saying, for much of the past 10, 15 years, expressing the odd concern about current account deficit, balance of trade deficit, fiscal deficit. The point was, over the past 10 years, it didn't seem to matter. Sterling was strong, the dollar was strong, those rules of economics didn't seem to apply. What's changed?
They don't apply until they apply. Nothing has changed. The rules of economics always are going to be the same. Supply and demand is always going to govern a lot of things. But when you have a bubble or when you have a mania, sure, people ignore things. The emperor has no clothes. You know the story as well as I do. People just ignore it. They forget it. But then, when things do start going wrong, then everybody looks around and says, oh my God, we've got a huge balance of trade deficit. And when things start spiraling downward, all the bad news comes to the fore. When things are booming, all the good news comes to the fore. Bad news is thrown away. Unfortunately, we're now in a period when all the bad news is going to come to the fore because the rules have not changed.
So if you're in charge of Britain at the moment, you're saying you don't see a great deal in terms of what Britain can offer that people want to buy around the world, stands in contrast to Singapore and China, for example. What would you do? Would you try and turn industry back to manufacturing, or what can be done?
Well, first of all, I would ask you, is there something that the UK has that they can sell that's going to grow fast enough to fill up those two gaping holes? If there is, you should tell us. You should tell us all, because we want to buy the stocks. Something is going to be a huge growth industry in the UK if there's something that'll fill those holes. The UK has got to adapt. Unfortunately, you have to let a lot of people go bankrupt. The government keeps bailing out its friends rather than letting people go bankrupt. And then new companies will rise up and will come to the fore, and Britain will recover. There'll be some pain in the meantime. I mean, you've had a long period of